I read this edgy manga that I think you should check out. This is sort of a review and analysis of that manga. Written and illustrated by Shina Soga, Necromancer was published in 2009 in the Shonen Serious magazine. In short, Necromancer is about a necromancer named Asutsu Johann Faust. Asutsu lives in the slum section of what is presumably London, and if you make a contract with him, he will resurrect a loved one. On the surface, this sounds all pretty simple, especially for a manga that is only like 20 chapters long, but in reality, there is a lot more to it. Before we really get into things, we should probably talk about the art. The art is heavily stylized and may be a bit off-putting at first, but it matches both the themes and the tone of the story very well. Also, this video contains massive spoilers, so 100% go make sure you read the manga first. You won't regret it. That aside, let's start off with the story. The first chapter is more of a pilot chapter, and I'm pretty sure it isn't canon, but it establishes two rules of necromancy. Rule 1, you have to have the remains of the person you want to revive. Rule 2, the necromancer will get your soul. We also learned that a consequence of necromancy is that resurrected souls have stronger desires than they did when they were alive. The example used in this chapter is that love becomes more passionate and hate becomes more brutal. I'm fairly certain that this is just like a pilot chapter though, so let's move on. The story begins with a detective, Ricket, arresting a man who is suspected of being behind recent kidnappings. Ricket has a very strong sense of justice, but she is unwilling to bend the rules for the sake of fulfilling this justice. She understands that nobody is above the law. During this chapter, Ricket meets Asutsu. Ricket dislikes Asutsu at first, but because he isn't doing anything illegal, she is incapable of stopping his practice. I don't really want to spoil the story, but in short, edgy stuff and necromancy shenanigans occur. Soga does an excellent job of foreshadowing the events, with the story of Raphael, and Ricket almost goes through like the entire Dirty Harry arc. It's a pretty good chapter. The next chapter opens with Ricket questioning Asutsu, trying to find out if he is a legitimate necromancer. During this, a customer comes and asks Asutsu to resurrect her brother, who is, or was, a famous actor. In exchange for 3 years of the sister's lifespan, Asutsu agrees to res the actor. Upon his resurrection, the actor soys out and starts acting like a moron. Since Asutsu has proven he is a legitimate necromancer, Ricket leaves, and Asutsu speaks with his familiar, Stolas, about the play the actor starred in. The play is about a guy who tries to free an enslaved village from the demon Moloch, but the hero finds out that the supposed villagers are willingly partaking in sacrifices and stuff. In order to save the villagers, he must fight them. The hero sacrificed his humanity in order to help the people, but the hero really didn't help anyone. He just forced his morals onto others. One could draw a parallel between the hero and the actor's sister, who resurrected her brother so the show could go on. It would have been better if she did not interfere, but, like the hero, she had a faux sense of duty that was just an excuse to justify her own desires. The end of this chapter has a pretty cool twist that I don't really want to spoil, but it shows you just how cold Asutsu really is. I'm actually not going to cover the fourth chapter in depth because, like the third chapter, it has a bit of a twist I don't want to spoil. It also has more darker themes that probably couldn't really be talked about, especially for a channel of my size. This chapter reinforces how cold Asutsu is and how he takes pleasure in others' misfortune. The fifth chapter is all about Asutsu's familiar, Stolas. Asutsu goes to a candy shop in order to purchase chocolate for Stolas. While he is making his purchase, a gangster enters the shop and tries to buy the same chocolate. This leads to a confrontation, in which Asutsu scares the gangster off. To be honest, nothing really of note happens in the first chapter, besides the fact that Stolas and Asutsu have some sort of contract, where Asutsu gives Stolas chocolate in exchange for something important, but we'll cover that later. That does it for the first volume, but there are a few things I'd like to mention that I didn't really know where to put in elsewhere. It is important to note that Asutsu lives in the slums, and he often revives the poor because of this. He sets his price based on how much he thinks one could afford. In the first volume, we see Asutsu taking advantage of people, only for them to experience misfortune, which Asutsu relishes in. This contradicts Ricket's character, who is a police officer who is far removed from the poorer population, but despite this, she looks out for them and tries to help them in any way she can. In short, Asutsu preys on the unfortunate's downfall, while Ricket is the opposite. This is supported by how in the first chapter, Ricket pretty much almost quits being a detective, because she failed to understand the bigger picture of things in the slums, and how in literally almost every chapter in the volume, Asuso takes pleasure in his client's suffering. The 6th chapter deals with themes of abuse, so if you're not comfortable hearing about that, here's a timestamp that you can take to the next section. Okay, the chapter begins with a woman and her abusive boyfriend, who is a drug dealer, visiting Asuso. In a rare moment of compassion, Asuso asks the woman if it is alright for her to be in this relationship, but she tells him that it's alright because she loves her boyfriend. Sometime later, Ricket confronts Asuso, asking him the whereabouts of the drug dealer. Asuso tells her the story of Amphispena, which is that of the two-headed snake that moves by biting itself. Although the snake could move in any direction, its venomous fangs will result in only one outcome in the end. Without knowing it, it'll slowly end its life. Back with the couple, after beating his girlfriend, the drug dealer finds the apartment that he shares with his girlfriend is on fire. The dealer enters the building in order to save his product, but his girlfriend believes he's trying to save her instead. Unfortunately for the dealer, the building collapses and ends his life. Literally one frame after the collapse, Asuso pulls up and greets the woman. She begs him to res the dealer, but he refuses, saying the body is too messed up to be used in the ritual. Although it is heavily implied that Asuso had something to do with the fire, he berated the woman for being in a relationship with the dealer, which is just like, bruh. I think that this is meant to relate to the Moloch shenanigans in chapter 3. And I think it's, pretty obvious how it relates, so I'm not gonna waste your time. The 7th chapter introduces us to a new character, Nokkenfrissun. Her name literally translates to Bone Eater. Jokes could be made, but, I don't want my 30 sub channel to get nuked. While Asuso is negotiating with potential clients, Nokkenfrissun comes out and informs the clients, who are bank robbers trying to revive a traitorous friend, that Asuso is trying to con them. Nokkenfrissun offers them a better deal. In exchange for a single bone and 1 year of someone's lifespan, she will resurrect the traitorous robber for a day, so that the other robbers could extract their information. For clarification, the living robbers want to revive the dead robber, who had betrayed them and stole their money before dying. The robbers accept her deal, but in a turn of events, the traitor kills the surviving robbers and keeps all the riches for himself. Unfortunately, for him, he dies, and Nokkenfrissun gets to keep all the wealth, but as a demon, she doesn't really care. This chapter has a pretty simple message, chasing materialism will lead to ruin. Materialism is a very human concept, and one would be better off living for memories as opposed to items. One can only have so much, and when they die, it's all gone. Chapters 8 and 9 are an actual art, so I'll just analyze the whole thing when I finish up the recap portion. It begins with a gravekeeper observing a woman who is mourning her deceased husband. She writes her deceased husband letters, and the gravekeeper responds to them. One day, the gravekeeper discusses the idea of resurrecting the widow's husband, but she rejects the thought. Then, after the gravekeeper leaves, she digs up her husband's body and makes her way to the Necromancer, but the gravekeeper intercepts her. But as they discuss the pros and cons of resurrection, the widow is beheaded. We then cut to Ricket, who is talking to a colleague about the recent beheadings. There have been 29 victims so far, and nobody knows anything about the culprit. The killer is called Jack the Ripper, but they are not related to the real-world killer. Ricket decides to visit Asuso to see if he knows anything about the crimes, since he deals with death and all. When Ricket arrives, the gravekeeper is telling Asuso about Jack. He informs Asuso and Ricket that the killer is a well-put-together man. In this exchange, we cut to the gravekeeper killing a woman. Ricket catches him in the act and confronts him. During their confrontation, a man enters and states he is the real Jack, and the gravekeeper is just a copycat. We found out that the real Jack was killing for pleasure, while the gravekeeper was killing bad people and abusers. We then jump to Asuso, who is speaking with Nokkenfrissun. To sum things up, we learned that Nokkenfrissun is in debt to Asuso, and he asks her to pay off said debt by helping him save Ricket and the gravekeeper. In a turn of events, this was unnecessary, as the gravekeeper decapitates Jack. The group goes to Jack's lair and retrieves the widow's head, and in exchange for the gravekeeper's soul, Asuso resurrects her. Okay, so first this arc is all about moving on. The widow tried to cope with her husband's death by writing letters, but the gravekeeper responded to the letters, which prevented the widow from entering the acceptance stage of grief. In the letter that is shown, you could actually see the widow was in the bargaining stage of grief, asking for a way for her husband to return. Although he had good intentions, the gravekeeper prevented the widow from moving on, which ties into the earlier theme of sacrifice. This is met with irony, where the widow tries to convince the gravekeeper that she'd have the Necromancer resurrect her husband. Not really sure how to segue into this, but we also see the gravekeeper being called creepy and strange based on his appearance. but when in actuality he is a pretty chill dude. One could probably argue that his actions were even heroic, and this contrasts Jack, who was a handsome, well put together guy. As simplistic and surface level as it is, it really does show that appearance isn't everything, but yeah. Finally, this arc also sees another rare compassionate moment from Osutsu. He was willing to use an extremely powerful demon to save the detective who borderline harasses him every single day. Although he is a cold, arrogant moron, there is a lot more to Osutsu than just being an edgelord. The 10th chapter is a dark and depressing one-shot about escapism. I don't want to go too much into detail because I think you should just read it on your own. I think you should just read it and come to your own conclusion. It also isn't part of the main story. I also think that it'll be sort of polarizing, though, because it isn't subtle at all. The 11th chapter is about a kid who wants to become the Necromancer's apprentice. The kid, whose name is Kulan, states he would like to be a Necromancer because Necromancers make people happy. Osutsu explains that being a Necromancer kinda sucks, but Kulan doesn't care. Osutsu takes advantage of the situation by having Kulan clean stuff for him. Sometime later, Ricket joins them, and she sees that Kulan is a total nuisance, and decides to let him try necromancy on his own. Kulan resurrects some dead people, and then Osutsu tells him that he was using his own soul to fuel the resurrections. Now, Kulan cannot perform another resurrection without ending his life. Kulan flees, and sometime later Stolas confronts him. Stolas tells Kulan that Osutsu's family had formed a blood pact with him, and that is why Osutsu is able to resurrect people without taking years off his own life. Overall, this chapter doesn't really tell you anything. All you really need to know is that Stolas and Osutsu have the blood pact, where Stolas mitigates the consequences of being a necromancer. The 12th chapter doesn't really move the story on, but its themes are important. It is pretty much just a commentary on the disparity between the upper and lower classes. It's a topic that has been explored time and time again. There really isn't anything I could say that would add to it, so yeah, just read the chapter, you'll like it. The final 7 chapters are part of a much larger, more important arc, so I will summarize and then explain like before. In chapter 13, we are introduced to the church, which is very corrupt. We meet a man and presumably his lover, and we learn that the lover is very ill. The man seeks out a cure from the church, but because he could not pay the religious leader enough money, his lover is left to die. She passes away, and Necromancer offers to help the grieving man. She directs him to the Necromancer, and we cut to the religious leaders. They are scheming about killing Osutsu, since his resurrections are considered unholy. The 14th chapter begins with Ricket and the police talking about a murder case. The victim is the man, and Ricket's superior informs her that the church is the #1 suspect. We see Osutsu being visited by a man in the girl's body, but instead of being the lover, it is the religious leader. Osutsu resurrects the girl, and she leaves with the religious leader. At the church, the leader informed an exorcist, Reinhardt, about the Necromancer. Reinhardt tells the leader that because of the 2 deaths, he must pay for his sins, and Reinhardt cuts the leader down. Meanwhile, Ricket's supervisors advise her not to investigate the church, but her overwhelming sense of justice outweighs the consequences of the investigation. Ricket tracks down the girl and is told to visit Osutsu. Ricket meets Osutsu, and they go to the morgue to find the lover's body. Unable to resurrect the corpse due to a lack of a proper lifespan, Necromancer is used to resurrect the man. The now living couple spends their last days together. The 15th chapter begins with the officials from the church attempting to capture Osutsu. Osutsu is shot, and the church officials leave. Ricket arrives moments later after hearing the gunfire. And Stolas tells her that because Osutsu is a necromancer, he's an extension of the devil in the eyes of the church. We then get a flashback to Osutsu's childhood. We learn that Osutsu had a pleasant childhood, but the burden of being a necromancer took a toll on his father. They lived in a village of necromancers, where they lived a simple, unbothered lifestyle. One day, Osutsu went to the city to play with friends, and he saw his friend's cat had passed away. Being a kind-hearted child, he resurrects a cat for the friend, but this freaks out his friends, and they report him to the church. When Osutsu returns from the city, he finds that his village has been destroyed, and his entire family has been killed. The exorcist Reinhardt is there, and he captures Osutsu. The 16th chapter is also part of the flashback, and it opens with Necromancer and Stolas discussing the various aspects of necromancy, and how the destruction of the village will affect that. We then cut to see the church officials taking care of a girl. The girl uses her position of power to save the captured Osutsu. We learn that she has magic blood, and it can be used to heal people, while the girl, whose name is Silverace, patches up Osutsu. He tells her about what the church did to his village. She's unaware of this atrocity, and she's greatly frustrated by what happens. She tells Ositsu that about her own troubled past, but just as they are bonding and becoming friends, Reinhardt enters and cuts down Ositsu. Chivalrace heals Ositsu, which results in Reinhardt trying to kill him again. Chivalrace jumps in front of the blade, saving Ositsu. Stolas and Necromancer, who are lurking around the church, enter and help Ositsu escape with Chivalrace's body. While they are safe, Ositsu resurrects Chivalrace, but she's unable to remember anything. Chapter 17 marks the end of the flashback, and we see Ricket speaking with Ositsu. They decide that they can trust the police chief. While at the police chief's house, Ositsu explains everything to him. We learn that Ricket is Chivalrace, and this makes Ositsu incredibly depressed. Stolas tells him that in exchange for his own soul, Ositsu can return Ricket's memories. Ositsu would have to resurrect 616 people in order to do this. Ositsu leaves and finds Ricket at his home. They argue for a bit about their situation, and we then cut to see Reinhardt killing people. Reinhardt leaves a note for Ositsu, telling him to surrender. When Ositsu finds the note, he decides to confront Reinhardt, but Ricket urges him not to, which causes Ositsu to soy out, and he pulls a gun on her while insulting her. Ositsu leaves a stunned Ricket to go and fulfill his necromancy quota. Chapter 18 opens with Ricket reading old newspapers about the church. She sees information about herself, and she begins to piece things together. Meanwhile, Ositsu meets Reinhardt. They battle it out, and Reinhardt defeats Ositsu. Before Reinhardt can land a killing blow, though, Ricket arrives and saves Ositsu. The two then work together to defeat Reinhardt. He explains her past to her, and then he prepares to kill Ositsu. Ositsu accepts his fate, but once again, Ricket frees herself and saves him. She berates Ositsu for being so selfish, and while she tries to give him a reason to live, Reinhardt runs her through with his sword. This enrages Ositsu, and he tries to resurrect Reinhardt, which kills him. Then Ositsu gives his own soul to resurrect Ricket for a second time. This causes the contract between Stolas and Ositsu to end, and Ositsu dies. Necromancer enters, and she speaks to Stolas about humanity and sacrifice. Stolas explains to her the beauty of being human, and how sad an existence of being a demon is. Stolas then trades his soul for Ositsu's, which brings him back to life. Necromancer explains to Ositsu what happened, and she tries to steal his soul, but Ricket stops her, which causes Necromancer to leave. The story ends with Ricket and Ositsu being happy together. It's pretty cheesy, but I guess it's kind of fitting for a story like this. But yeah, there was a lot to take in there. To begin with, I'd like to talk about Ositsu, since we learned so much about him in this arc. As a child, Ositsu wasn't anything like the cold, heartless man he was at the start of the story. He was a very compassionate kid, and this is displayed through his actions. As a necromancer, he was in a position of power, and he used this ability to help his friend. The consequences of his action resulted in the annihilation of his entire village, which is a pretty justifiable cause for Ositsu's demeanor to change. This, coupled with abuse from the church and his experiences with Ricket, would result in any faith in humanity Ositsu had disappearing. Similarly, the job of being the necromancer comes with many consequences. Almost none of the stories we read end well, and ultimately, only misfortune follows those who seek help from Ositsu. Ositsu copes with this by playing the role of a heartless man, trying to take pleasure in the pain his customers suffer. But as the story progresses, we could see this facade fall, and by the time we get to the end, Ositsu is free from the burden of being a necromancer, and he could finally be himself. Now let's talk about Stolas. Being a demon, Stolas is unable to relate to humans despite being attached to Ositsu's family for hundreds of years. Stolas was passed down from generation to generation, and with this came the responsibility of being a necromancer. Being a demon, Stolas has seen every aspect of humanity, and because of this, some humanity has seeped into him. After seeing all the sacrifices Ricket and Ositsu make for one another, he feels compassionate enough to sacrifice himself to save Ositsu and end the burden of being a necromancer. I know I could probably go more into depth with this, but the script is at like 4,000 words, and the end is not anywhere near. Regarding Ricket, she's a pretty static character. She always had a strong sense of who she was, both before and after the memory wipe. She had spent her childhood sacrificing her livelihood to help others in the name of a corrupt church, and this is foreshadowed in how she almost sacrifices herself for a corrupt law enforcement officer. I know it probably seemed like Ricket being chivalrous came out of nowhere, and I have to admit that you're right in thinking this. There really are not that many signs Ricket was resurrected early in the story, and you have no way of really seeing it, which is kind of disappointing as a reader. As I've said, I think Rikka is a static character, so there really isn't much more to talk about besides her actions, but I've already kinda covered those in the other sections, so yeah. I think that in a similar way, Necromancer is sort of like Reinhardt. Despite being a demon, she has far more many human desires than Stolas. She uses her abilities and position to manipulate others for her own gain. Every time she gets involved in a situation, it generally ends poorly, and her few acts of kindness are only just a means to an end, where she gets what she wants. As we find out, Necromancer longs to eat Osits's soul. Like, one frame after Stolas is out of the picture, Necromancer tries to eat Osits's soul. This is because she believes he's vulnerable, and she no longer has to pretend to be on Osits's side. There was no need to really try to get close to him or suck up to him, since he was just presumably unprotected. Thankfully, Necromancer had assumed wrong, and Ricket once again saves Ositsu, and Necromancer leaves with her tail between her legs. Now, let's discuss the theme of sacrifice. The couple that we see at the beginning of his arc makes large sacrifices for each other. The man tries to sacrifice everything he had to save the woman, and in turn, the woman sacrifices herself in order to be with her lover, if only for a day. One could probably argue that we also see the church official sacrifice himself for his beliefs, ultimately being killed for trying to stop Ositsu. Ricket, Ositsu, and Stolas also give their lives for each other. In order to resurrect someone, one must sacrifice a lifespan or their soul. We even see those who are meant to be the bad guys sacrificing themselves for what they believe in. Overall, the idea of sacrifice is very prevalent in this story, but how is it meant to be interpreted? When Stolas sacrifices himself for Ositsu, it has the positive effect of ending the cycle of necromancy and resurrecting Ositsu. On the other hand, in Chapter 2, when the actor's sister had revived him, by the end of the story, there's a net -2 loss. All in all, although sacrifice has its positives, there's an incredibly high risk of a negative outcome, and when dealing with sacrifice, one must keep a level head and make incredibly well-educated decisions. It even might be better not to tamper with the way things are. This concept is first introduced in the Moloch chapter, and through all the horrible outcomes we see from necromancy, I think this idea carries a lot of weight. But I think it would be better if you just read the story and came to the solid conclusion yourself. Alright, this bit's a little bit off script, but I kinda just want to talk about it even more. So regarding the story with Moloch, we see that the hero pretty much sacrifices, so that for like the millionth time in the script, he sacrifices an entire village to justify his morals. And you could make that parallel with other characters like Reinhardt, who sacrifices everything he loves, pretty much just to satisfy his own desires. I think that when sacrificing stuff for yourself is interpreted, or viewed, I guess, in an incredibly dark negative light, with the outcomes always being horrible, such as when the dealer entered the house for his product or whatever, as opposed to trying to like save his girlfriend. He had horrible like motivations, and those bad motivations resulted in his demise, I guess. I guess sacrificing stuff in your own self-interest always has a negative consequence. Like sacrificing something for somebody else's sake usually has a positive consequence. I guess that's sacrifice for you. I think it would be best if you actually read the story and you came to your own solid conclusion yourself. I know it probably also sounded like, I was hyping this up as like, the best manga in the world or something. But, in reality, it is a solid 7 out of 10. Although the themes are pretty interesting, the execution was a bit iffy here and there. But, yeah, I also left out a bunch of information. Go read it yourself, and, yeah. Thank you for watching. Later, gamers.